Good morning. My name is Jay Jones and I'm a sophomore here at Oxford. Today I will be presenting a paper that I wrote this past spring after a semester of reading and analyzing James Baldwin's work in a special topics in literature course taught by Dr. Eric Solomon. As you may know, James Baldwin was a Black queer writer and political organizer who analyzed the dynamics of race, class, gender, and sexuality in many forms, including novels, plays, essays, and speeches from the 1950s to the 1980s. This essay revolves around two central questions. What is James Baldwin's America, and what are its lessons for our own? Based on 11 of Baldwin's works from across his career, as well as modern analyses of his literature and politics, I outline my conclusions about both the failures and the possibilities of the America that James Baldwin spent his life critiquing. I am grateful to have this opportunity in this symposium to share some of the insights I gained from Baldwin's writing, especially given the strong connections that he saw between America's present and its legacy of enslavement, colonial genocide, and white supremacist violence. This is James Baldwin's America in Myth and Truth. James Baldwin saw himself as a witness, tasked with the responsibility of recording America's truth and all the ways it was distorted in the service of white supremacy. Baldwin had a complex relationship with America as the son of a country that denied both his existence and his right to exist, but he maintained hope for what was possible. For James Baldwin, America was the arbiter of myth through the erasure of history, the distortion of the present, and the creation of false figures, but it also had great potential to align with the truth of its history, its people, and its future. The deep reckoning with truth to which Baldwin dedicated his writings has not yet happened, but he left a roadmap for how we might find the path towards equitable, survivable, and collectively joyful life. Baldwin wrote extensively about the failure of America to recognize its past, its present, and its people. White supremacy is situated in a long and violent history that goes unacknowledged in favor of false myths. Baldwin argued that white people are trapped by the creation of a history they do not understand, yet one from which they often build their identity. Rather than confront this violent history, America relies on the colonization of non-white peoples and their history, supported by the white supremacist myth that all non-white peoples were discovered, civilized, and allowed into history. From their discovery onward, Black people were not only confined to white history, but also to white territory, whether enslaved on American plantations or under the constant threat of state violence in American cities. The erasure of non-white history is also maintained through, quote, American history books stating that Africa had no history and neither did Black people. Parallel to the erasure of Black history is the romanticization of early America as a virgin continent, allowing, quote, all dreams to become possible, discounting the violence upon which this supposedly virgin continent was forced open. Baldwin argued that white history and white innocence were, quote, entirely of the West's invention and threatened both its victims and its creators. Rather than acknowledge the violence of the past, America instead chooses to conceal its bad truth with good myth. Any past action which threatens to crack the foundations of American perfection is distorted to fit the myth of exceptionalism and innocence. In its mythical history, America causes no harm, expands democracy, and enacts its founding principles at every level. The realities of colonization, genocide, enslavement, and both legal and extra-legal violence and exclusion are reduced to mere mistakes on the path towards a more perfect union. America tells itself and its citizens that, above all, it is innocent of these accusations. Once raised to believe America's mythical history, any proof of oppression causes profound cognitive dissonance. Non-recognition of past and present violence reinforces its traumatic effect and continues the cycle of erasure and abuse. America's foundation in myth ensures that no true justice can be built, because without revealing the myth, no change can occur. Rather than, quote, forget about all the past injustice and start from scratch, the truth of history must be actively remembered and used to, quote, turn from evil and do good. Parallel to the urge to forget our history, America distorts our perception of the present to prevent a reckoning with the past. White people believe that America is a free country because the hegemonic framing of racism in history tell them so. Once taught that this country, quote, has never lost a war, guarantees liberty and justice for all, and anyone can become president, white people can easily believe that America's earlier harms are all in the past and we will keep moving forward. Baldwin makes this point clear in his novel Another Country in an exchange between the interracial couple Ida and Vivaldo. In response to Ida's statement that, quote, our being together doesn't change the world, Vivaldo says, it does for me. While Vivaldo's understanding of whiteness changes when in relation to Ida's Blackness, her knowledge of Black American womanhood is unaffected because the intersecting violence of racism and sexism still threatens her life, but only Vivaldo's ignorance is threatened by the love of a Black woman. Through the denial of history, it is also possible to deny the roots of Black suffering in America. With no history in which to contextualize these harms, the poverty, criminalization, and violence against Black Americans are perceived as having been brought upon themselves by some cultural or biological failure. For white America, these supposed failings justify the abuses that stem from, quote, the first legal recognition of Black presence, which remains the most compelling. The myths of America's history opens the door to the lies about America's present, and if one believes that America embodies, quote, the standard of human freedom with which we began, they are not likely to demand a change to the conditions of the present. American perceptions of the present are also distorted through a lens of exceptionalism, where the non-white world must be corrected to American standards. People of color are expected not only to conform to white understandings of success, but to actively want them. And the possibility that one might not desire to be, quote, integrated into a burning house is erased. Whiteness is the standard, and white supremacist myths uphold this belief. This also has the effect of erasing Black America's right to create an identity that is not tied to its subjugation. Because where whiteness is the norm, Blackness suffers the consequence of America's failure to, quote, evolve any place for it. Simultaneously, America distorts the small concessions made to the civil rights movement as perfecting the Union. Black resistance mounted against the white standard is transformed into the nation's next big success. And in conjunction with the erasure of history, the present is heavily distorted in the name of preserving white supremacist myth, both the harms suffered by Black people and the victories of Black resistance, rather than confront what has been done, what continues to occur, and what will happen if nothing changes. The past and present are reconfigured through the creation of false figures and a false relationship between them. Baldwin stated repeatedly that, quote, something awful must have happened for white people to choose white supremacy over their true selves. He argued that white people do not truly know what motivates their violence, and that this emptiness results in both Black death and white trauma. Police, for example, are, quote, as ignorant as they are frightened, with only the state's word to support their sense of superiority and thus their sense of self. White Americans are taught myths in place of real history, and only ignorance about the white self is sanctioned. The disconnection from truth is ingrained through elders, schools, and the state, but this ignorance is maintained by the willingness to believe in white supremacy and to enact its violence. As Lorenzo, a Black character in Blues for Mr. Charlie, argues on the stand following the murder of a close friend, white people would, quote, cut my tongue out before you'd let me tell you all that I know about hating white people. Through the production of a false white figure, White people are broken off from their identities, their history, and the context of their relationship to Black people. Conversely, Black people are framed as having never contributed anything to American society, having no history outside their relationship to whiteness, and having no personhood except in stereotype. Beginning in the era of enslavement, Black people were constructed in the white imagination as docile and mindless, rather than simply trying to survive a system that would kill them otherwise. Today, this false figure is lazy, dirty, dishonest, overly sexual, and criminal. Whether these are true does not matter to the white imagination. What matters is that these explain the harmful conditions Black people experience without indicting whiteness. In truth, even if constant negative perception can often result in negative behavior, none of the characteristics ascribed to Blackness are inherent or natural to Black Americans. And this disconnect between the reality of Black life and the construction of false figures is nearly impossible to resist individually. Because even if one does not intend to let white people, quote, tell me who I am, limit me in that way, and polish me off in that way, it is much larger than any individual interaction. The production of false knowledge around Blackness not only dehumanizes Black Americans, but perpetuates and justifies the oppressive conditions under which they are forced to live. At the intersection of these two false figures is the false relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed. Because hegemonic understandings of whiteness and Blackness are misconstrued in favor of white supremacy, where whites are valorized and Blacks are reduced to burdens on the American dream, these false figures justify Black Americans' disproportionate suffering through the disparate valuations of white and Black lives. If Black people deserve the hardships they experience, as told by white supremacist myth, then they must be the problem. This so-called Negro problem is created by white people to, quote, safeguard their purity by projecting disconnected identities and histories onto the oppressed. Baldwin often argued that the problem of Black American presence was not, in fact, a problem of Blackness at all, and instead allowed Black people to know the truth of whiteness that white people refused to learn. The white imagination fails to acknowledge its past and present, and this distorts its understanding of Blackness and of itself. As a witness to truth, Baldwin understood the importance of not, quote, simply obeying the rules of society, but instead questioning them unceasingly. However, no matter how harshly Baldwin criticized America, it was always in the service of preserving America and its ideals, as he firmly believed that myths and lies would ultimately cause America's downfall. Baldwin acknowledged that no one, including those who inflict violence, consciously sees themselves as a villain. At some level, they may understand the harm and its legacy, but to actively acknowledge it would reveal true American history. Until a collective acknowledgement of this history occurs, a traumatic reverberation continues to harm victims of white supremacy and the nation. The myth of innocence, quote, invites America's own destruction, because if we are not willing to seek out the truth, we will, quote, slowly discover that there are many ways to die. To preserve the possibility of justice and liberation, we must take the risk and make the sacrifice. In addition to revealing the distortions of the past, present, and people on this land, James Baldwin also dedicated much of his work to seeking out the undistorted truth by learning the real history of America and untangling people's true identities from white supremacy. Although the reckoning with truth that Baldwin sought has not yet occurred, his writing provides lessons for today's America, which, though significantly changed, remains the same at its core. Baldwin argued that because America's foundations are constructed from white supremacist myth, and so many Americans today refuse to confront it, healing and change must be preceded by confession. Confession means rejecting the lies told over hundreds of years and understanding that whiteness is not what it thinks of itself. It may be impossible to grasp the magnitude of the harm done by and to our ancestors, but the path of liberation means, quote, telling as much of the truth as one can bear and then a little more. Confession means accepting that one has done wrong, but it also means being willing to move in a different direction. Baldwin believed that revealing America's hidden laws and assumptions was a crucial part of undistorting the truth. Rejecting the myths and distortions told by and about America makes room for the truth and for the potential to embody the ideals of justice, equity, and freedom. In the face of white supremacy's active disconnection of people and their history, Baldwin also argued that finding the truth of America also meant finding the truth of oneself by being, quote, present at his life, for only active presence allows the world to, quote, open up before him. The reliance on innocence and ignorance as a defense against learning the truth can never lead to liberation. And so telling ourselves the truth about what we have done, what we are doing, and what might continue to happen is the only way to shift the course. Rejecting white supremacist myth is not enough. We must replace it with real, true, undistorted history, not centered on the supposed authority of whiteness to discover and civilize non-white peoples. Baldwin argued that because history is inescapable, its oppressive reshaping does not eliminate historical trauma, but instead repeats it. Baldwin reasoned that because Black Americans have the advantage of never believing white supremacist myth collectively, they will not be shaken by the truth. So however uncomfortable this reckoning is for white people, we must reject, quote, the most successful conspiracy in the history of the world, white supremacy. The past cannot be dismissed as irrelevant to the present because moving forward requires us to know what happened. The history we acknowledge, whether true or false, shapes the future we make from it, and a future with any hope of freedom must be constructed from knowledge of the harm done. Baldwin believed that learning history must also be accompanied with its intentional use. So rather than, quote, drowning in it, accepting historical truth requires an intentional telling of history to build from. In response to the whitewashing of civil rights demands within the white progress narrative, Baldwin argued that an entirely different story of both the past and the present must be told. We act in the name and legacy of our history, so our actions must originate from a true telling. Oversimplified, whitewashed, and romanticized history is not enough, no matter how painful or uncomfortable the full, uncensored truth may be. Distorted history must be ruptured in favor of the confessional, redemptive nature of truth. To confront the false figures constructed by white supremacy, including the so-called Negro Problem, Baldwin urged Americans to seek out an identity not based in these falsehoods, to finally, quote, be able to live with oneself. To resolve this tension and build relationships of mutual respect and coexistence, it is necessary to confront the question of one's identity without relying on the distorting myths of whiteness. Though made impossible within America's current framework, learning to love oneself, love one another, care without hierarchy or scarcity, and be accountable is necessary for a world where, quote, the Negro problem will no longer be needed. Since enslavement, Blackness has been defined as in opposition to whiteness. Especially in conjunction with false figures, America views Blackness through a warped lens. Baldwin was adamant that white vocabulary always failed to encompass the Black experience, and that to connect with the true self, a new vocabulary must be produced that destabilizes white selfhood because, quote, if I am not what I've been told I am, then it means that you're not what you thought you were either. To decenter whiteness is to make words that embrace, liberate, and enliven Blackness, because only then can we know who we are and how we relate to one another. If closing one's eyes to distortion and violence is an invitation of one's own destruction, as Baldwin wrote, opening our eyes to the truth is an act of survival. Baldwin argued that daring, quote, to hope to become and to surrender the dream of safety was the only path forward through its acceptance of the unknowability of the future and of one's place in it. Letting go of what is known, especially a lie so comforting as one's own innocence, unsettles the very foundations of what life was before and what it might become in the future. Rejecting white supremacist knowledge means dealing with the pain avoided through hate. However, the truth which brings pain also brings freedom, no matter how, quote, difficult to swallow. Comparing truth to a written record, Baldwin argued that even if we refuse to read it now, quote, the day is coming when we will have nothing else to read. Our willingness to accept and account for the truth is what will determine our survival. The rise of whiteness depended on the construction of a false history, but now our survival depends on, quote, the speediest possible demolition of this history and the restoration of truth. The imposition of white supremacist narratives across the globe trapped non-white peoples in a false history they had little power to counter. Freedom means demolishing the foundations of white supremacy and laying new ones grounded in truth. Solid houses cannot be built on shaky footings, so collective liberation cannot be built on anything other than justice. James Baldwin's America was a complex set of institutions that relied on a colonized history, a distorted present, and a collection of false figures rooted in white supremacy. His America was also a site with great potential to undistort the truth of its history, its present, and its people, for the sake of collective survival and freedom. Baldwin was a witness to the truth, and although his analysis grew more radical over time, his insistence on a rejection of lies and a reckoning with truth never wavered. To, quote, stare our ghastly failure in the face and confront the trouble within ourselves is the only way for us to transform deeply enough to survive together. This means disrupting the comfort found in white American myth and using our real histories intentionally. It also means that simply stating the facts of the past is not enough if we, especially those in power, are not also working toward cultural, financial, and material reparations. We need to transfer power into the hands of the communities that have been oppressed for so long and abolish institutions that continue the legacy of enslavement and colonization. Baldwin wrote that our task is to, quote, mount an unending attack on all that Americans believe themselves to hold sacred, because without destruction, there is no space to rebuild. There is much work to be done to reach a place where collective reckoning is possible, but by following Baldwin's guiding light, we may be able to find our way closer to freedom. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions now.
That was amazing, Jay. Thank you. So I just wanted to start by saying that when I arrived to Oxford College as a student in 1985, and I'm on the faculty here for those of you who don't know me, we had Oxford Studies, and the way it was organized then was that every semester we would have a book that we read collectively, and then we took a pen and paper quiz on it. And one semester, probably in my first year, it was The Fire Next Time. And listening to you talk about being shaken by the truth, I can say that having grown up in East Tennessee, there was nothing in my life or in my K through 12 education that prepared me for reading James Baldwin. And sadly, there was very little in my Oxford education to prepare me either. And that's not an indictment. It's just, it was a different time, I think. And I would like to think that things have changed. I'm not really sure, but I didn't react to it very well. I was not able to read that and to be shaken by the truth that he was telling. So I'm wondering if you can share with us, or if you're willing to share what it was like for you, Jay. I'm very curious. When you, in a different generation, are encountering this for the first time, as I think as a white identifying person, I'm a white identifying person, what was it like for you to be shaken by the truth?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully I had been, yeah. Thank you. Thankfully, I had been a little more exposed to like Black radical thought prior to entering college. And the fact that the summer before I entered college was the 2020 uprising following the murder of George Floyd definitely sort of exposed me more to those ideas and to James Baldwin's writing because people quoted him so many times during the summer. So it wasn't necessarily a shock to read what he was reading, what he was writing, but it definitely specified a lot of the issues that had come up over the past several months and over the past hundreds of years. And so it definitely put words to issues that had sort of been floating around untalked about for a long time.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My question relates to colonialism in general, and it's because most of my research is done on British colonialism and the effect it had in India and in Africa, and then in America. So my question is, in the last 2 days, I've heard a lot about American whiteness, but it seems as if Britain is just not taking responsibility. And when we look at the education system, for instance, I want to refer to the concentration camps in South Africa, where I think 35,000 white women and children from Dutch descent and around 27,000 indigenous Black people died, also mostly women and children, as a result of the British concentration camps that were signed off by Queen Victoria. But for some reason, it doesn't seem like Britain is taking any atonement or acknowledgement. Children don't learn about concentration camps in the school. So my question is, if we go further back in history, and it's not a question of placing blame, but in what sense do you think British colonialism has influenced the way that white Americans think? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I would obviously have to do more research into that to give a full answer. But I think that generally speaking, we consider Britain to be sort of the parent of America because the British colonies sort of expanded into the US. And that the patterns of colonialism that Britain engaged in and still does engage in sort of taught the US how to do that, even if it happened in different ways and in different places. And so I think that even though sort of our histories are different, they intersect in a lot of ways, and that sort of a reckoning with white supremacy and colonialism can't happen in just one place. So it would have to be with Britain and all of Europe and America and everywhere that sort of white supremacy and colonialism have impacted the world.
There isn't a question, but I just wanted to let you know that everybody is thanking you online and really appreciated the paper. And also wanted to thank you for bringing up colonialism as well. So
Thank you.
Jay, thank you so much for your continued inspiration. I wanted to ask you, you do such a thorough job in this paper of synthesizing quite a bit of Baldwin's body of work. And I know we studied quite a lot of it, if not all of it. And I know that we discussed in class the notion that many Baldwin scholars have of a increasing pessimism across as we chronologically follow his intellectual trajectory. The Baldwin that we get in The Fire Next Time of shaking the truth and shaking my dungeon shook, all of those kinds of things, it's not quite the same Baldwin that we get in the Evidence of Things Not Seen. Do you, in your reading of Baldwin, do you think that he is optimistic that these lessons that you've articulated here from his work, that we can learn them as a nation, as a people, as white identifying people specifically?
I can't like talk about his mental state when he was writing, but based on how his writing changed over like when his career, I think that it reminds me of the idea that Miriam Kaba has. She's a Black radical abolitionist, that hope isn't necessarily like an emotion that you might feel, but instead something you practice. And so I don't know if necessarily he felt optimistic or hopeful like as an emotion, but I think that he stayed committed to working towards that future as if it were possible, regardless of whether he sort of felt hopeful or optimistic.
So Arthur Sudler, one of the participants online, pointed out that the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation at the University of Hull is doing some amazing work around, I'm assuming, British colonial rule and slavery. There are also a couple of other questions. Sue Gilman asked the question, are you familiar with the work of Lillian Smith? I asked because it seems like she was working in the realms of the lessons.
I am not, unfortunately, but I'm sure that many Black and Indigenous radicals today and in Baldwin's time have very similar sort of outlooks on America and how it works and how we might move forward to James Baldwin.
Anne Burkholder, and you'll have to forgive me if I'm pronouncing your names wrong. Well done and courageous. My question is, how do we get white people to want to and to commit to an undistorted truth and learn from their true history?
It's such a complicated question that many people have been trying to answer for a long time. And so I'm not going to have all the answers. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm not going to have all the answers that people for many, many years haven't come up with. But I think a part of it is not necessarily relying on like being super enthusiastic, like relying on white people to just want to do it. Instead, like not giving us a choice about whether or not we confront what is real history, like what we and every generation before us has done on this land. And so I think that it's not necessarily a question of how do we get white people to want to do it. It's more how do we get to a point where those, like that history is undeniable regardless of where you are and where you're learning it.
Roderick Holland said, thank you for connecting the dots from the past to the present in this presentation. And then Richard Guess, your presentation is a co-keynote presentation. Beautiful and inspiring encapsulation of the big themes of the whole conference. So thank you.
Thank you.
And then Elizabeth West had a question. Which of Baldwin's works would you recommend as an introduction to him for high school or college students?
Yeah, I mean, all of them are great and super informative. And they all, a lot of them tie over the same themes, which is why I was able to reference so many in one paper. But the fire next time, I think, is one of the most informative for me. So that would be a good one to start with.
Any other questions in the room or in the virtual room? I will say that Sue Gilman said that she just read your bio and she thinks you would be inspired by Lillian Smith. So she encourages you to read it. And your professor is nodding. So, well, thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Jay.
Thank you.